Okay, hear me out. Working theory. If Legendborn is Buffy and Bloodmarked is Buffy's seasons 4, arguably also season 5, then Oathbound is Angel. And not just because there is a demon auction that is heavily prevalent. Well, I guess an Angel, that's only one episode, but still. Is this relevant? No. Is this something that tickles my millennial mind? Absolutely. And with that, you now know that yes, I have finally finished Oathbound. I am so far behind, especially considering the Legendborn cycle is probably my favorite ongoing series right now. Well, I also love Amari. It's hard. It's one of my favorite, if not my favorite, ongoing series right now. It's reignited a lot of joy and theorizing while also letting me live in this robust fantasy world with a protagonist that I love with my whole heart and an ensemble that I care about very deeply, which, as we know, by the third book in a series can be incredibly stressful. And in fact, that is why I am so far behind. Not just that I was behind on my rereads of Legendborn and Bloodmarked that I wanted to do jumping into this book so I could fully appreciate everything Deonn is doing, because she ties things together in ways that I feel like I need the full context fresh to be able to fully appreciate. And even still, I don't know that I am fully appreciating. So this is going to be an exploration of the book, but also just kind of fangirling. And because it has been so long since the book came out, or at least a couple of months, there may be spoilers in this discussion, just so that you are aware. But we left off Bloodmarked at a pretty stressful point, right? Bree has given herself up to the Shadow King, which I will pretty exclusively be referring to as the Shadow King in this video, not so much for spoiler reasons, but for avoiding pronunciation mistakes reasons. And so we start there, and I got about 250 pages into this book before I put it aside for a little bit because, one, I was coming up into April where I was going to be incredibly busy and knew I wouldn't have time to sit with the book the way I needed to and wanted to. But two, I was getting really stressed out. And there was a lot about this plotting that really stressed me out. There were some plot devices in here that aren't necessarily my favorite devices or tropes when considered by themselves, but were utilized here in a really interesting way, but were still stressing me out. And so I had a lot of guilt about putting it aside for a bit, but I knew I needed to finish it when I could just sit with it and finish it. And so we had a long weekend, and that is exactly what I did. And now we are going to sit and talk about it. Hi, if you don't know me, my name is Melody. We talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel. And ideally with that, every Friday we talk about a book more in depth. And we have been talking about the Legendborn cycle on this channel since it started. The video quality has evolved quite a lot, but nonetheless, I have been fangirling over Brie Matthews since the very start. And one thing that really struck me on these rereads, because this was my third reread of Legendborn, was Legendborn holds up in every reread. There's something new to discover, especially in relation to considering it with Bloodmarked. It was a lot of fun to kind of piece those things together. And also Bloodmarked was a lot smoother of a read this time. Not that it wasn't smooth before, but I was less stressed because I knew what the ending was. Not to say that the ending doesn't still stress me out, but I knew where we were going. With Oathbound, everything was new, so I didn't have any comfort. And to be completely honest, there is not a lot of comfort to be had in this book. I mean, there is, but it is very much a middle book, even more than Bloodmarked in some ways. In Bloodmarked, we had those really awful but important scenes and moments at the Institute that were really hard and dark, but here it feels like we are moving even, because we are moving even more away from the Order and from the Legendborn, which is completely necessary. And this book really puts us on a trajectory, though less than I thought it might once it was introduced, that I have been expecting from this series since the beginning, because we are reimagining the idea of Arthurian legends, and this is our quest book. And when we are thinking about quests in relation to the idea of Arthurian legends, and please keep in mind, I am not an Arthurian scholar, however, the quest is active, as it is in this book. However, the quest is also incredibly symbolic. And what is it symbolizing? Here we're not going after or questing after the Holy Grail, but we are kind of questing after this idea of self-discovery and playing with the idea of who we are versus, or who Bree is in particular, and her friends as well that live in the shadows of these legends, how they are themselves and the legend. Or more specifically, who are they without the shadow of that myth or that legend, which is also kind of distilled in this line from the book on page 459, if you want to follow along, though I am reading it out of my reading journal. Legends are born from a kernel of truth, but myths create meaning because people treat them like truth. And so this gets us to the idea of how this book, the main kind of central conflict of this book, is of course that Bree has gone away with the Shadow King, what she has bargained away in order to become stronger, and what her fight really is, both in terms of herself and for herself and not letting Arthur completely take her over, but also her relationship within the Order, which has turned against her, and what she is ruler of and who she is ruler of. And in a lot of ways, this book has really confirmed my theories from the last book that kind of started being played with, the idea that we are gonna have to burn this all down, and that we should burn this all down. And so we are in a different world in this book immediately. It deviates a lot from the narrative choices and what we're used to from the first two books because of some of what we have to do narratively in this book. And so we are separating Bree from her people. While she was separated from the Order for a significant portion of the last book, which was already kind of jarring, right? Because we'd barely been introduced to the Order in book 1. And then we were on the run for most of book 2. And here we are separated from that world completely because we really set up that world as an antagonist in a lot of ways. But in book 2, Bree still had Alice. She still had Will. She still had Sel. She still had her people in whatever way. And here Bree really only has herself, because as part of her bargain with the Shadow King, he very early on steals her memories of the people she loves in her life. And we are introduced to two new characters in Zoe and Elijah within the world of the Shadow King. And so we keep expanding this world and getting new characters. And at first I was a little nervous about that because we already have so many characters within this world and such a strong ensemble. And even within Bloodmarked, we expanded that ensemble pretty significantly, which was sustained in this book. We got characters like Valak, thank goodness, back. But I was actually really charmed by Zoe in particular at the end, just because we spent the most time with her. And I think it was important narratively for us to have those characters because Bree needed someone to play off of, and we needed to see who she was distilled down to her core. We know who Bree is based on her actions in book 1, but she's been so defined in relation to the Order that this book is about kind of stripping her down to her core, and who is Bree at her core, and what does Bree fight for at her core, as well as showing her and showing us as the reader her friends fighting for her on the other side as well. Because one of the biggest narrative changes in this book is that it is not solely from Bree's point of view, which honestly is partially just a storytelling and a narrative fix in whatever way, because Bree's point of view is so limited, but there is so much information as a reader that we need. But with that, we are being given or getting peeks into even more information than we had before, and we're getting to see Bree through other people's points of view, getting to see Bree and the care people have for Bree as Bree outside of her identity as Arthur through those points of view, which I think is really special. Additionally, I think I've made it pretty well known in my reviews of these books how much I love, in particular, Will, and we get a lot from his point of view, and I absolutely adored getting his point of view, and especially with what he was grappling with, because there really is, especially in the early part of the book where we are in these points of view more, because toward the second half of the book we do stay closer with Bree once we get to what I refer to for myself as the YA house party with only one bed, because that's what it is. But Bloodmarked was really about Bree kind of having her eyes opened to the realities of these systems and what she's up against as a Black young woman against these hierarchical systems of power and these legacy systems of power. And the beginning of this book is really Nick coming and swinging against these systems of power. Nick's energy in this and his almost singular focus on Bree and his willingness to burn everything to the ground was magnificent. But just as magnificent in other ways was the care that we saw from characters like Will, who again is a personal favorite, for his friend Bree, and his recontextualizing and recognizing the ways that he has silently benefited and the ways that he hasn't actively contested the very systems of power that he has benefited from in whatever way, and he has seen harm his friend, but maybe he hasn't been as active, even knowing that he's a good guy and he's doing his best and how much he cares for Bree, knowing the ways that he's failed and the kind of power structures he's fallen back into. And there's just a lot of care there in seeing these characters called in and checking their privilege and doing better and moving forward and trying to make better choices in context of that, and the kind of recontextualization of a lot that we get through these alternate points of view. For instance, through Will's point of view, we get a really significant scene after the calling at the end of the first book. We get to see Nick by Bree's bedside that we don't get to see in the first book because we are in Bree's point of view and she is unconscious. And so we get to see Will's interaction with Nick. We get to see the absolute care and single-mindedness Nick has for Bree in that moment. And then we also get a little moment with Sel and Nick there as well through that point of view, and get a lot more of the nuance and history of that relationship, which is extra important because Sel is not in his right mind for most of this book and is really on the back burner for most of this book. We see him with his mother. He is kind of over there. We get points of view from his mother almost in kind of logs, but he's not really central until he is incredibly central at the end with yet another twist that is really rude in context of the fact that we're going to have to wait a long time for the next book. Another significant point of view that is actually missing from this book, and why it's missing, is Alice. And this is really hard, right? Because Alice is Bree's childhood best friend. Their friendship is one of the most heartbreaking things of book one, in that kind of tension of childhood friends growing and changing when they enter a new environment, and kind of the stresses of Bree making some decisions that Alice doesn't have the full context of, and the pressures of her behavior and how their friendship is growing and changing. And then the beauty of that in book two and how beautiful that friendship is. And so Alice is in a coma fighting for her life for most of this book. She has been taken and given to Mariah and that group to kind of be looked over. And Mariah is able to see that she is basically kind of stuck in this loop where she is fighting for her life, and the symbolism of that. And that stinks because Alice is kind of the heart of things in some ways as well, especially as the one in the group without magical powers. Though after the next book, will that be the case? Who knows? And it's hard to not have Alice, and even knowing that Bree wouldn't know her, which would be heartbreaking in its own right, I do think that it's a very specific choice to have Alice out of the game for the main portion of this book. One, it's something for Bree to fight for at the end, especially in relation to herself and the core of her and her humanity and who she is as a person, and even if that's kind of tested in the final moment of the book. But more importantly, I think, as kind of established with that long friendship between Alice and Bree, Alice is the person that knows Bree the best in whatever way, but also that knowledge and that kind of long-term knowledge holds Bree back in some ways, because she is always going to be viewing Bree as her childhood friend and an older version of Bree, even as she's growing and changing with Bree. And so for this narrative, Bree needs to be able to make big growth and big change within herself, and also have kind of no burdens of preconceived notions of who she is. And even without those memories, that's kind of what Alice represents. And so having her out of the game for much of this really is kind of further symbolism of this journey, this quest that Bree is going on to know herself better. At the same time, Nick is undergoing a much more tangible and real quest to seek out a way to get Bree back. And so he is going after the Morgaines in an effort to gain intel about where she may be. And he is kind of a wild card for most of this book because he is no longer seemingly really falling in line with the Order, which also makes sense to him as we know him, even from the beginning, because he was only pulled back into this world by Bree. So why would he really care about the rules of this world other than his friendships and the people he does care about? But he's not telling Will everything either. Will goes with him and Lark goes with them so that he is with Will, let's be real. So we have a kind of budding romance between Will and Lark, as I think we all could see coming, but is delightful and satisfying nonetheless. And it's early stages here. It's still less overt declarations and more action, which may be more satisfying in some ways because action reveals character. But getting to watch Lark care for Will and recognizing where Will is pushing himself and the sacrifices he's making, as well as some of his pain that he hasn't really acknowledged, even though I think as readers we could sense that it was surely there, especially with losing Whitty in book 1 and whatnot. And so Will has really been funneling a lot of his energy into his work. And so on a high level, we have the narrative reasons for Bree's, it's not even memory loss. I mean, it is, but it's memories taken. There is a narrative reason for that. But at the same time, it is at its heart an amnesia plotline, and I really struggle with those. However, we get to see her and Nick interact later in the book, even still. And it's heartbreaking in some ways because she doesn't know him. And he's the one coming this time with all of the knowledge and the context. However, in some ways, it does really circle back to this idea of courtly love that we talked about in the Legendborn Feature Friday years and years ago, and how that tension builds with that, and this idea of love and the sacrifice of love and all of that being this kind of heightened ideal within the world of Arthurian legend, and how that serves especially the heightened emotion of young adults so well. And we're seeing that then furthered here, and we know there are obstacles to their relationship even without this memory loss. However, knowing Nick's state of mind, it may not be as big of an obstacle as it once seemed, with the order that no lines of the Legendborn should cross. And so since Nick is the heir of Lancelot and Bree is the heir of Arthur, they should not be together in any way. And so in the idea of courtly love, there is this obstacle and this idea of what is keeping a couple apart, which we see most iconically in the love triangle between Guinevere and Lancelot and Arthur, which does beg the question, because we have a very clear love triangle here with Nick and Sel and Bree, which I have very particular thoughts about how I would like that to be solved. And based on the buzz and the hubbub I've been seeing online, I think more people may agree with me than once would have. In my shipper heart of hearts, that I do think that there is textual evidence for, including in this book even, I don't think that choices necessarily should have to be made if we have to pick either or, if you catch my drift. However, at the same time, I do think that that obstacle feeds into that idea of courtly love. And listen, I am a millennial, and while I have lived through a Cassandra Clare that managed to satisfy both love interests in a love triangle, I have also lived through the ending of A Sweet Far Thing by Libba Bray. And I do not put it past Tracy Deonn, because this is not a romance series. This is a supernatural YA fantasy series about Bree coming into herself and her power that has a very strong romantic component, and knowing the themes of courtly love and this idea of sacrifice, and even the ways that some of these characters have tried to sacrifice themselves and their feelings already. I trust none of them, and I don't trust a happy ending, bittersweet or not, until I have it in my hand. Now, do I think we will have a tragic ending? No, because this book, this series, is about celebrating Bree and Bree's power and Bree coming into her own and celebrating her power as a young Black woman and celebrating the love of those around her for her and her being able to accept that love as well. And so I don't think that there's an ending where Bree isn't happy and fulfilled in some way. Now keep in mind, I also haven't been reading a lot of what Tracy Deonn has been saying since this book came out because I was dodging spoilers for so long. So there may be more direct insight into that, absolutely, but I just don't see that with the trajectory of this series, what this series is celebrating, what this series is saying. And I do think that this series, especially after this book, ends with the order as we know it falling in some way. Whether it's rebuilt is an excellent question. What the rebuilding of that looks like is an excellent question, but I do not think it's even a matter of toppling or overthrowing the regents in power. I would kill for some visual symbolism of a literal breaking of the table, a breaking of Excalibur, something, which we may get, but I don't foresee that system of power holding, and the entire series is about interrogating those systems of power. I am very interested because as we move further away from it, we are exploring Arthurian legend in different ways. Legendborn was very close to those original legends, and now we are really pushing out the bounds of that world. And so even in book 2, where we were seeing more of the magical world and kind of recontextualizing the order within this larger magical system and magical world, we're pushing that even further here, especially with the potential introduction of hell dimensions, which really is further support for this book being Angel, because maybe, just maybe, we are going to be going to a hell dimension. I would not put a hell dimension past the next book. And I'm very interested to see how that's going to work. I'm very interested to see if that will allow us to get Bree, Sel, and Nick together again, because Bloodmarked was really more about Bree and Sel, and Oathbound really reconnected Bree and Nick, and we got to see how that connection runs deep. Even when Bree can't really remember him, she is drawn to him, and it was about the kind of essence of her. Now with that relationship as well, I forgot to mention, there was that revelation where Nick came into the knowledge that maybe Lancelot and Arthur, as these kind of inherited entities, are supposed to be at odds, that Lancelot is a check to Arthur's power in whatever way, which in theory sets them in conflict with each other, right? I feel like that revelation was meant for us to see them as in conflict with one another, but I found that more interesting in relation to that being a kind of checks and balances of power, and that in fact it shows them as a more perfect match for one another. So I will be very interested to see how that idea develops over the rest of the series. But back to the house party just briefly, because I loved the setup of this. I mean, it was an auction, a demon auction, but the way it forced a lot of these characters together and the way that we saw the plotting kind of lead all of these characters together was really satisfying, because the beginning of the book did start out kind of slower. I mean, this is an over 600-page book, and we had to have time to establish this new stasis for Bree with her lack of memories, and it's all about who she is and what she fights for at the essence of her, without that fight being for the others in her life. And so she is inevitably drawn to this place in trying to help some root crafters, and so there really is a kind of trafficking subplot to this. And this house party is really important in a lot of ways, because yes, it provides this really kind of fun scenario for forcing these characters together and the way these characters are interacting. However, it also, while widening the magical world, is a further exploration and indictment of systems of power and those who chase power and the corruptive nature of power and what people are willing to do and sacrifice and who they are at their core. It's this kind of exploration of these people at their core and what they are driven by in their quest for power and money, their greed, what have you, contrasted against Bree's real core and essence and what has put her there. Yes, she's having to lie and maneuver within these scenarios in order to kind of forward her goals. And we have the goals of her freeing these young women kind of contrasted and combined with how she has to maneuver, considering both the Shadow King and the Order and what they want from her and from the world at large, and how they are all ultimately using her as a pawn. And Bree has to start making the moves for herself and figure out what motivates her to make those moves and what those moves are. And so even if a lot of the dramatic devices of this novel are things that I don't love like amnesia plot lines, I think that the way it was executed was so smart, as Deonn's work really always is, and I understood why we were making the choices we were making and what it was revealing about our characters and some of the things it's setting up for the next book. I would never have the hubris to anticipate what we are getting in the next book, but there is a lot set up here. And listen, I could keep rambling on about this book, but we have been here for a while. So I guess what I will kind of boil it down to is that this is definitely a connector book. This is definitely a middle book. And middle books are never my favorite of a series generally because I like resolution. I know, shocker, but Return of the Jedi was my favorite Star Wars as a child because I liked having the satisfaction of that ending, but that doesn't mean that the journey to get to that ending is less compelling. And there were so many moments in this that were so satisfying, moments that revealed character in interesting ways, moments that were clearly setting up the further thematic ideas of the series and positioning us for some really big moments in the rest of the series in ways that I can't wait to see how those play out, as well, of course, as moments that satisfy the shipper heart in me. So I think that it does a really good job at forwarding the story, connecting the pieces, and I can't wait to see how everything plays out. I definitely think that we needed the additional space and that Bree needed the additional space to get us where we're going, and I can't wait to see where that is. And as usual, we have ended on a note that leaves us clamoring for more. And with that, if any of you are fanfiction writers, there is, even with me being behind, a lack of fanfiction to get me through this hiatus, and I am not a fanfiction writer. That is not my gift, so I would really appreciate some more fanfiction in this world if that is your calling. But if you've read this book, I would love to hear your thoughts. I would love to hear your theories. I would love to hear you just fangirl about Bree with me. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah, bye.